The city had a steady nighttime rhythm, a subtle beat of distant traffic and shimmering neon signs that never quite reached the quiet corner where Giannis, a small family restaurant, stood its ground. Inside, the air was thick and warm, filled with the comforting aromas of garlic, simmering tomatoes, and fresh basil. It felt like a world apart from the cold, towering glass and steel structures where real fortunes were made and lost. Here, the most important things were serving a good meal and making sure the customers were happy. Rosalie wiped down the same spot on the already gleaming counter for the third time, her eyes drifting towards the clock. Her feet ached in her practical shoes, a familiar, dull pain that signaled the end of another long double shift. She was saving every single tip, every extra dollar, for her little sister, Serena. The thought of Serena, with her bright eyes and dreams of becoming an artist, was the fuel that kept Rosalie going. Art school was expensive and their parents were gone. It was just the two of them, and Rosalie had promised that no matter what, Serena would have her chance. The bell above the door chimed, a gentle sound that usually meant a late-night regular was craving pasta. But instantly, the atmosphere in the room changed. The few other diners, an elderly couple in the corner, suddenly became intensely interested in their plates, avoiding eye contact. 3 men walked in, and the air seemed to thicken and grow still around them. They moved with a quiet authority that had nothing to do with raised voices or dramatic gestures. It was in the way they took up space, claiming it without even asking. Rosalie knew the type, or at least she knew the stories about them. This was their city, and men like this were part of its shadowy legends. The leader, Seo, was a name often whispered, rarely spoken aloud. He was younger than she expected, with dark, intense eyes that missed nothing and a stillness that was more intimidating than any overt display of power. He chose the booth in the back, the one with the best view of both the entrance and the kitchen doors. His 2 companions, Alberto and Massimo, sat with him. They were larger, more imposing, but it was clear they revolved around Seo, watching him, waiting for a signal. She took a deep breath, smoothed down her apron, and walked over to them, order pad in hand. "Good evening. Can I get you gentlemen something to drink to start?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden flutter in her chest. Seo looked up at her, and his gaze felt like a physical weight. He didn't smile. He simply stated their drink order in a low, even voice. As she turned to get their drinks, she overheard the tense, hushed conversation beginning again. "It's a disaster, sir," Alberto muttered, his voice a gravelly whisper. "That idiot financial guy, he didn't just make a bad investment. He evaporated it. It's gone. Vanished into thin air." "500,000, Massimo added, the number hanging in the air like a bad smell. "Just poof. How do we explain this? How do we recover?" Rosalie moved away, giving them the appearance of privacy, but their words lingered in her mind. She was good with numbers. She had to be, carefully budgeting her meager wages down to the last cent to keep a roof over their heads and some savings in the bank. The thought of losing that much money was a terrifying, abstract nightmare. She brought them their drinks. Seo thanked her with a slight nod, his mind clearly elsewhere. She took their food order, and as she was about to leave, he did something unexpected. He leaned back in the booth, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile someone makes when they are about to tell a joke that only they will find funny. He looked at Rosalie, this tired waitress in a simple uniform, and decided to amuse himself. "Hey," he said, his voice cutting through the grim tension at the table. His men looked at him, confused. He kept his eyes on Rosalie. "Let me ask you something, a hypothetical question." He waved a hand dismissively. "Say you came into a large amount of money, a very large amount, and you needed to keep it quiet for a while. Make it grow, but keep it safe. What's the first thing you do?" Alberto snorted softly into his glass. Massimo looked down, a faint blush of embarrassment on his cheeks. They thought it was a cruel joke, their boss teasing the poor waitress with a problem she could never possibly understand. Rosalie, however, paused. She looked at Seo, and for a moment, She saw past the intimidating presence and the dangerous reputation. She saw a man with a problem, a money problem, and that was a language she understood fluently. She thought of her own life, her own small, carefully managed funds. She wiped her hands on her apron and met his gaze directly, her brown eyes serious and clear. "Well," she began, her voice calm and practical. "You wouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. That's just asking for trouble." She held up one finger. "First, you'd split it right down the middle. One part, a big part, you'd put somewhere super safe like a rock. It doesn't move. It doesn't grow much, but it can't disappear. That's your safety net." She held up a second finger. "The second part, that's your growing money. You find a few different, steady places for it. Not one big, flashy thing. A few smaller, quieter things that grow slowly like a garden. That way, if one gets a little sick, the others are still healthy." Finally, she held up a third finger. "And the last, smallest part, that's your oops money, for surprises. For things you didn't plan for. That way, you never, ever have to touch the safe money or panic and sell the growing money." She looked at the three men. Alberto and Massimo were no longer smirking or looking away. They were staring at her, their mouths slightly agape, their food completely forgotten. The simplicity and undeniable logic of her plan had hit them like a thunderclap. It was so obvious, so fundamentally sound, and it was the exact opposite of the complicated, high-risk nonsense their highly paid, now fired expert had sold them. Rosalie, oblivious to the shock she had caused, simply nodded. "That's what I do. I'll go put your order in now." She turned and walked back towards the kitchen, leaving a profound silence at the table. Sio watched her go, his joking demeanor completely gone, replaced by a look of intense, sharp, focused concentration. He had expected a flustered stammer or a confused shrug. He had not expected to receive the most brilliant and clear-headed financial strategy he had heard in years from a waitress at a tiny restaurant. The shock was like a cold wave that washed over him, leaving his mind racing. He looked down at the massive tip he had planned to leave as a condescending gesture for playing along with his joke. Suddenly, it felt like an insult. He left it on the table when they finally left. But as he stepped out into the cool night air, he knew one thing for certain. This was not the end of his conversation with the waitress named Rosalie. The weight of the previous night settled on Rosalie's shoulders, not as a memory, but as a dull, persistent anxiety. The encounter with the dangerous men, especially the one named Sil, felt like a strange dream. She had replayed the conversation in her head while counting her tips, the crisp bills feeling heavier than usual. His question had seemed like a joke, but the intensity in his eyes when she answered was not humorous. It was probing, like he was looking for something. She tried to shake it off, attributing it to the general strangeness of late-night customers, and focused on the comforting routine of closing the restaurant. Her only goal was to get home, check on Serena, and sleep. The next day passed with the usual rhythm of prep work and the lunch rush. It was a Tuesday, slow and predictable, and Rosalie found herself lulled into a sense of normalcy. The fear from the night before had faded, replaced by the more immediate concerns of inventory and a stubborn stain on table 4. When her shift ended, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the street. She said goodbye to the day cook, pushed through the back door into the alley where the dumpsters sat, and took a deep breath of the city air, grateful for another day done. He was there, leaning against a sleek black car that looked wildly out of place next to the overflowing garbage bins. So, he was alone this time, without his two large shadows. He stood perfectly still, dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored dark suit, his arms crossed. He wasn't wearing sunglasses, and his dark eyes found hers immediately, pinning her in place before she could even take a full step. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic, terrified flutter. Every instinct told her to run, to scream, to go back inside, but her feet felt rooted to the cracked asphalt. "Rosalie," he said. His voice was calm, level, and it wasn't a question. He knew her name. The fact sent a fresh chill down her spine. She managed a tiny, stiff nod, her hand tightening on the strap of her worn purse. "What do you want?" The words came out as a whisper. He pushed off the car but didn't come any closer. A small gesture she vaguely appreciated. "The advice you gave me last night," he began, his gaze never leaving her face. "It was not a joke. I need you to understand that." She blinked, confused. "It was just common sense." "Common sense is the most rare commodity there is," he replied, his tone dry. "I have men who work for me. They are good at what they do. But the man who was handling my money, he lacked your common sense. He lost a great deal of it." Rosalie swallowed hard. The $500,000 number whispered by his men echoed in her mind. She couldn't even conceive of that much money. "I am offering you a job," Seo stated. His words simple and direct, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You will be my personal financial advisor. You will tell me how to manage my assets. You will use your baskets for eggs." The absurdity of the situation crashed over her. A waitress and a mafia boss. It was insane. You can't be serious. I'm a waitress. I balance my own checkbook, that's all. I'm not a financial expert." "I have had experts," Seo said, a flicker of something dark, perhaps a memory, in his eyes. "They use big words to hide small ideas. You use small words to explain big ideas. I need your mind, Rosalie, not your degree." He then named a figure, a weekly salary. It was so large, so astronomically beyond anything she had ever earned, that her mind went blank for a moment. It was more than she made in a year, in multiple years. She saw Serena's art school tuition paid in full. She saw a safe, clean apartment in a better neighborhood. She saw a future where she wasn't counting every single penny, where the constant grinding pressure of bills would simply vanish. The temptation was a physical ache, a golden, shimmering mirage of security. But the danger was a cold, dark pit right beside it. She looked at Seo, at his impassive, handsome face, and saw the world he represented. Violence, secrets, fear. "It's a dangerous job," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Yes," he admitted without hesitation. There was no sugarcoating, no false promise of safety. "The world I live in is dangerous, but you would be under my protection, completely." Her thoughts flew to the one person who mattered most. "My sister," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Serena, she's 14. She knows nothing about any of this. She can never know. She can never be involved, never be touched by this world. You have to promise me." Seo considered her. This wasn't a woman bargaining for more money. She was bargaining for a soul. She was drawing a line in the sand around the person she loved. He, a man who broke promises for a living, found himself respecting that line. "On my life," he said, the words quiet but absolute. "Your sister will be a ghost to my business. No one will know she is connected to you. No one will go near her. She will have the life you want for her. This I swear to you." The final barrier in her heart crumbled. The promise, spoken with such grave sincerity, felt more binding than any contract. The money offered escape, but his vow offered a perverse kind of safety for Serena. She was stepping into the darkness so her sister could stay in the light. She looked down at her scuffed shoes, then back up at his waiting face. The alley seemed to hold its breath. She took one final, shaky breath, making a choice that would change the entire course of her life. "Okay," she said, the words small but decisive. "Okay, I'll do it." The transition from the greasy, warm air of the restaurant kitchen to the hushed, cool silence of Seo's private office was like moving to another planet. The office was on the top floor of a nondescript building in the financial district, and it was all dark wood, soft leather, and a breathtaking view of the city skyline. There were no personal photographs, no colorful paintings. It was a room designed for business, for decisions made in quiet tones that echoed far beyond its soundproofed walls. This was where Rosalie now spent her afternoons. After her morning shift at the restaurant, her life had split into two distinct halves. The first few meetings were stiff, formal affairs. Seo would sit behind his massive desk, a fortress of polished oak, and Rosalie would sit in the chair opposite, a notepad and a simple laptop open before her. She started from the very beginning, explaining concepts he had never had to consider. She spoke of digital trails and legitimate business fronts, of investments that grew slowly and quietly, like a deep-rooted tree, rather than a flashy, explosive firework. She showed him how to use spreadsheets, her fingers flying across the keyboard, coloring cells and creating charts that turned his chaotic wealth into an organized, visual story. Seo watched her, his expression unreadable. He was a quick study, his mind sharp and analytical, but it was her method that captivated him. She didn't speak the dry, confusing language of the bankers he despised. She talked about money as if it were a living thing that needed to be fed, sheltered, and guided. "This is your rainy day fund," she would say, pointing to a column of numbers. "This is untouchable. This other part, this is for planting seeds. We'll watch them grow." Her simplicity was her genius, and he found himself not just listening but learning. Slowly, the fortress of the desk began to feel like an unnecessary barrier. He started sitting in the chair beside her, looking over her shoulder at the screen, close enough that she could sometimes catch the faint, clean scent of his cologne. The formality between them began to thaw. He started asking questions not just about the numbers but about her. "How did you learn all this?" he asked one afternoon as she explained the principle of diversifying assets. Rosalie kept her eyes on the screen, a faint smile touching her lips. "Necessity. When you have very little, you learn to make every single penny count. You learn the difference between what you want and what you truly need." She didn't elaborate on the struggles, the nights of canned soup and patched-up clothes, but he could hear the history in her voice, a quiet strength forged from hardship. In turn, he began to offer small, fragmented pieces of himself. He told her how his own father had been a reckless man, gambling away what little they had on loud, foolish schemes. "I saw what chaos did to a family," he said, his voice low and even. "I promised myself I would never let that happen to mine. Order, control, that is everything." He didn't say how he had gained that control, the violence and the intimidation that were the foundations of his order, but she understood. For him, this wealth wasn't for luxury. It was a wall against the chaos of his past. He began to show his care in practical, unspoken ways. He noticed she always looked tired, stretched thin between her two jobs. One day, he simply stated, "You will quit the restaurant. The hours here are enough." It wasn't a request. It was a command, but one born from observation, not dominance. Another time, he discovered her taking the bus home late at night. The next day, a quiet, serious man named Domenico was introduced to her. "Domenico will drive you," Seo said. "It is not safe for you to be alone after dark." He didn't mention the rivalries, the constant low-grade threat that was the background noise of his life. He framed it as a simple matter of safety, and she, for the first time, felt a flicker of something warm and protected in his presence. The air in the office changed. The focus on numbers and strategies remained, but it was now layered with something else, a growing, unspoken connection. They began to share quiet lunches in the office, simple food from a local deli, talking about books, about the city, about their childhood dreams. Rosalie found herself looking forward to these afternoons, to the intensity of his focus, to the rare, genuine smiles that softened the hard lines of his face. The fear she had initially felt had transformed into a deep, compelling curiosity, and then into something warmer, more dangerous. She was no longer just his employee. She was becoming his confidant, the one person in his world who looked at him not as a boss to be feared, but as a man to be understood. And so, a man encased in ice found himself thawing in the steady, gentle warmth of her presence, discovering a peace in her company that he had never known was possible. The fragile peace of their new routine could not last. It was built on the hope that the outside world would not notice the quiet revolution happening inside Seo's office. But the world of men like Seo was one of constant vigilance and predatory instinct. A shift in the wind was always noticed. The news of Seo's sudden financial stability, his moves into new legitimate businesses, and the mysterious disappearance of his money troubles did not go unnoticed by a rival. A man named Massimo, who ruled a neighboring territory with a greed that was as sharp as a razor. Massimo was a man who believed in force, not finesse. He had laughed when he heard Seo had fired his financial experts. He had stopped laughing when Seo's organization began to thrive. Rumors, thin and insubstantial at first, began to circulate. There was a new advisor, a ghost, someone with a brilliant, unseen hand guiding Seo's fortunes. Massimo did not know a name. He did not know it was a woman. He only knew that this person was a threat, a weapon that needed to be found and broken. His men were given one order: find the ghost. Rosalie, cocooned in the safety Seo had built around her, was unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. Her life had taken on a new rhythm, one filled with a purpose and a connection that went far beyond money. The fear was a distant memory, replaced by a growing, thrilling affection that made her heart beat faster every time she walked into the office and saw Seo waiting for her. She had quit the restaurant. Serena was happy and safe, asking her sister about her new office job with innocent curiosity. Everything felt like it was falling into place, a beautiful, impossible dream. It ended on a cool, clear evening. Her meeting with Seo had run late, the two of them so engrossed in a plan for a new shipping company that they had lost track of time. Domenico, her driver, was waiting downstairs as always. She said goodnight to Seo, a lingering look passing between them that was full of unspoken words and promises, and stepped out into the parking garage. It was a quiet, concrete space, poorly lit, and her footsteps echoed as she walked towards the car where Domenico stood, holding the door open. She never saw the two men who emerged from behind a support pillar. They moved fast with a practiced silence. One shoved Domenico hard, sending him stumbling back against the car. The other grabbed Rosalie's arm, his grip like iron. A scream caught in her throat, choked off by pure, paralyzing terror. She could smell the man's stale breath, see the cold intent in his eyes. Her mind went blank, filled only with a white-hot panic. Then, a sound erupted that wasn't a gunshot, but something more primal, a roar of pure, undiluted fury. Get your hands off of her. So, he hadn't gone back upstairs. He had stood watching her from the elevator, a habit he had developed, a need to see her safely to the car. He had seen the men move. He crossed the distance in a few powerful strides. He moved with a terrifying speed and violence she had never seen in him. He didn't pull a weapon. He was the weapon. He grabbed the man holding her, wrenching his arm away with a force that made the bone crack audibly. The man cried out, collapsing. The second man turned, but Seo was already on him. A series of brutal, efficient strikes that left him unconscious on the concrete floor in seconds. It was over in less than 10 heartbeats. The silence that followed was louder than the violence. Seo stood over the two men, his chest heaving, his knuckles bleeding. His face was a mask of cold, murderous rage. But when he turned to Rosalie, it shattered. The rage was replaced by a raw, desperate fear. He strode to her, his hands coming up to cradle her face, his touch surprisingly gentle against her chilled skin. Rosalie, look at me. Are you hurt? Did they hurt you? His voice was rough, frayed with an emotion so intense it shook her to her core. She could only shake her head, her body trembling uncontrollably. The shock of the attack, the sudden violence, and now the terrifying depth of his reaction left her speechless. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against his chest. She could feel the frantic hammering beat of his heart against her cheek. He was holding her as if she were something precious, something he had almost lost. He buried his face in her hair, his voice a low, a fervent whisper brushed against her ear, each word laced with barely restrained fury. I will kill them. I will burn his entire world to the ground for this. No one will ever touch you. No one will ever scare you like this again. I will break anyone who tries. I swear it to you. The words weren't just words. They were a vow, a dark and terrible promise born from a protectiveness so absolute, so possessive, it stole the air from her lungs. In that instant, the last vestige of their carefully constructed facade crumbled. She wasn't merely an employee, and he was far more than just her boss. The meticulously built walls of their professional relationship lay in shattered ruins at their feet. She tilted her head back, her tear-filled gaze meeting his. The world outside, with all its inherent dangers and lurking fears, seemed to recede and fade away. There was nothing but his face, his strong arms wrapped securely around her, and the undeniable raw truth blazing in his eyes. He lowered his head, his lips finding hers with a possessive urgency. It wasn't a tentative, gentle kiss. It was a claiming, a long-overdue confession, a desperate release of all the pent-up tension and unspoken feelings that had been simmering between them for weeks. It was fierce and passionate, fueled by the adrenaline of the fight and the terrifying relief of her safety. She tasted the salt of her tears mingled with the faint, metallic tang of blood from his split knuckles. It was a promise of unwavering shelter from the storm, a declaration made not with carefully chosen words, but with a desperate, all-consuming need. And as she kissed him back, her hands gripping his shoulders with fierce determination, Rosalie knew with a certainty that resonated deep within her soul that there was no turning back. She had willingly stepped into his darkness, and somehow, impossibly, he had become her guiding light. The world didn't simply snap back to normal after the brutal attack in the garage. A new, stark reality had solidified in its place, forever defined by the invisible line that had been irrevocably crossed and the powerful promise that had been forged in its fiery wake. For Rosalie, the lingering fear was like a cold, heavy stone lodged in the pit of her stomach, and it took days for it to gradually dissolve. But its icy grip was steadily, relentlessly warmed by the fierce and unwavering presence of Seo. He was undeniably different now. The last remnants of his carefully maintained professional detachment had finally crumbled and disappeared. When he looked at her, there was no filter, no pretense, no self-imposed barrier. There was only a raw, unfiltered devotion that was both incredibly thrilling and profoundly humbling. He was a man who had glimpsed the horrifying possibility of losing something precious, something irreplaceable, and he would never, ever take its presence for granted again. The retaliation against Massimo was swift, brutal, and absolute. Rosalie was deliberately kept in the dark about the specifics, and she made no attempt to pry. Seo ensured that she remained far removed from the ugly and ruthless mechanics of his vengeance. All she knew for certain was that the hushed whispers on the streets had undergone a noticeable change. The name Massimo was now spoken exclusively in the past tense, a cautionary tale grimly recounted as a stark warning about the utter folly of challenging Ciro, especially when it involved something or someone he considered his own. The message was crystal clear to every rival and every supposed ally within the city's intricate web of power. The woman under Ciro's protection was, in effect, an extension of the man himself. To even think of touching her was to willingly invite utter annihilation. A week after the harrowing attack, he came to her small, unassuming apartment for the very first time. He stood in her modest living room, looking for all the world like a king unexpectedly visiting a commoner's humble cottage. And yet, somehow, he didn't seem at all out of place. He was there primarily to see Serena. He shook her hand, this bright young girl with Rosalie's eyes, and asked her polite, genuinely interested questions about her artwork. He was formal, respectful, almost courtly, a far cry from the violent, terrifying man she had witnessed in the garage. He was meticulously upholding his silent promise, building an impenetrable wall between her sister and his dangerous world with his own two hands. Witnessing him there, making that conscious effort, meant more to Rosalie than any elaborate declaration of love ever could. Later that evening, after Serena had finally gone to bed, they stood together on her tiny balcony, silently overlooking the glittering tapestry of city lights spread out before them. The silence that stretched between them was comfortable, easy, and filled with the unspoken understanding that everything between them had fundamentally and irrevocably changed. "This cannot go back to the way it was," Seo said quietly, his voice a low, resonant rumble in the cool night air. He wasn't looking at the city. He was looking directly at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. Rosalie's heart skipped a beat, then another. "What do you mean?" I mean the business, he said, turning to face her fully. He took her hands in his grip firm and reassuring. The old ways. You showed me a path that isn't just about hiding money, Rosalie. It's about building something real, something that lasts, something we could be proud of. He took a deep breath, a rare display of vulnerability in a man who always seemed so absolutely certain, so utterly in control. My world is dark. It has always been dark. But you are the light. You are the only truly good and honest thing in it. Stay with me, not just as my advisor but as my partner in everything. He wasn't simply asking her to be his girlfriend. He was offering her a share of his throne, a voice in his kingdom, a position of unparalleled influence. He was promising, in his own way, to fundamentally reshape his entire empire for her, to painstakingly build a future where his power stemmed from legitimacy and respect, not from fear and intimidation. Because she had somehow made him want to become a better man. Tears welled up in Rosalie's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy, of profound and overwhelming relief. She saw the man he truly was beneath the imposing facade of the ruthless boss, the young boy who had fought against the crushing weight of chaos and darkness and was now, for the very first time, fighting for something genuinely beautiful and worthwhile. She saw his unwavering strength, his fierce loyalty, and the deep, abiding love that burned for her alone. Yes, she whispered, the single word carrying the full weight of her hopes, her dreams, and her entire future. Yes, so I'll stay. I love you. He pulled her into a fierce embrace that felt like finally coming home, a sanctuary of unwavering strength and absolute safety. The sprawling city stretched out beneath them, a dazzling tapestry of light and shadow. But on that small, unassuming balcony, they existed in a world entirely of their own making. He was still an incredibly powerful and undeniably dangerous man, and the world they inhabited was still fraught with peril and uncertainty. But now he had Rosalie by his side, and that changed everything. She was no longer just his love or his trusted advisor. She was his conscience, his moral compass, and his most trusted partner in every sense of the word. Together, they would not simply manage his vast fortune. They would build a lasting legacy, forge a new kind of family, and transform the haunting shadows of his past into the solid foundation for their shared and promising future. If you enjoyed this captivating story of dangerous love and a power that was profoundly transformed by the unwavering strength of one heart, imagine what other compelling tales are just waiting to be told. Subscribe now to join us on our next thrilling journey into a world where heart-stopping romance meets undeniable destiny, and where the most unexpected connections have the power to change absolutely everything. Your next favorite story is just one click away.